Hello and welcome everyone, Honoree-Louise here with my first world building discussion. So from the title, you can see that I'm going to talk about naming the unfamiliar, and by that I mean things that you made up for your fantasy or sci-fi world. So I had the idea for this discussion after watching Avatar: The Last Airbender for the first time, and because this is inspired by the way the animal in this world is named, I'm going to use them extensively as example. That is not to say that the discussion is restricted to animals. Moreover, at the end of this video, I'm going to extend the concept of unfamiliar things from things that are simply made up to things from other cultures that may be unfamiliar to the target audience. So, let's get started. I think there are 3 different ways to name something that doesn't exist in our world. The first one is to use the same name as something that we do have, given that the two things are similar. You can see this right away in the first episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. When Aang mentioned penguins for the first time, we obviously picture our own penguins, but about 10 minutes later, we see that this is not the case. But we can see that the penguin in the Avatar world is similar enough to our own that we wouldn't mind them being called penguins. Furthermore, the misunderstanding, at least in this case, was not allowed to go on for too long that we would feel cheated by, not knowing what penguins actually look like. Anyway, I've been talking about how calling something unfamiliar by a familiar name is okay, but actually it's a very nice thing one can do because the first time the penguin was mentioned, there was no unfamiliarity to distract the audience from what was actually going on. That being said, this is easier to do in visual media than in writing because as soon as you see the animal or object, then you get the right idea. In writing, it's harder to do because for our characters, it should be obvious that the words that we are using already embody the correct concept of this animal or object. So, for instance, if I were to novelize the first episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender from Katara's point of view, it would be completely unnatural for her to think of a description of a penguin because it should be obvious. Suppose though, if I were able to concoct a situation where she had to describe a penguin, I will still be unable to use the most efficient way to describe it in order to make our audience understand, which is something like, it's like a penguin, but with whisker and nose instead of a beak, and with 4 wings instead of 2. And that would make no sense to Katara because a penguin is a penguin. That is not to say that it's impossible. One way I could think of to describe a penguin without being intrusive is to say it's flapped its 4 wings or something like that. But it's still difficult to do in writing. And perhaps that is the reason why we don't see this as often. Or maybe all the things we've been assuming that are the same as in our world are actually different, but the differences are just not important enough for the authors to go out of their way to describe them. Now, the second way is to modify or combine words that we have. For this, I'm going to use the example of turtle doves, and I'm going to pretend that we already have writing in order to convey this idea. So, the upside of this particular method compared to the first case is that given the name, it's not a stretch to assume that normal turtle and normal ducks do exist in this world, which means describing a turtle duck is much easier. Even if you cannot find a reason to describe it, because again, it should be obvious to the characters, the name itself already kind of signals some differences. The downside is you've given the audience enough information to start wondering what a hybrid between a turtle and a duck looks like. and this may prove to be distracting from the important things at hand. Finally, the third way is to come up with a completely new word. This way you don't give away any information about the animal or the object at all until you describe it. This can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the person reading the piece. For some people, this may be annoying because of the vagueness, but for someone like myself, this may actually be better than the second option. Going back to the turtle duck example, because I know something, my mind would immediately come up with different possibilities of where different parts should be, how they should all fit together, etc. However, if there is no information, then there's no point speculating. I will just move on and only become annoyed if the author let it go on for a really long time without any explanation. I do have to offer a caveat to this point though, is that if the thing you're introducing is simply to make the setting richer, like, turtle ducks, then me wondering is a bad thing because you don't want me to fixate on it. But if the thing you're introducing is something that is important to the plot, then maybe giving me a puzzle to solve is a good thing. Anyway, that concludes the main discussion. Now, as promised, I'm going to try to extend this to objects and concepts that do exist in some cultures in our world, but may be unfamiliar to the target audience. I think about this a lot while working on my current project because it is based on Vietnamese culture, but it's intended for an English-speaking audience, most of whom may be less familiar with my own culture. So, should I use the same English word when I mean something slightly different? In keeping with the animal theme, I'm going to talk about dragons. So, when I think of dragons, the first thing that comes to mind is something like this. However, in the Western canon, a dragon should be more like this. Now, I know that I'm massively simplifying the diversity within these two groups of cultures. And I do have to give my readers credit that they would not go into a story inspired by Vietnamese culture and expecting this. However, this is still a salient example to illustrate what I mean when I say that there are many times when I struggle to decide whether I should use an English word that is kind of close enough or if I should just use a Vietnamese word. I am not worried that using Vietnamese word would alienate my readers. To avoid that, I just need to practice my craft to make sure that I can explain the concept clearly and naturally, so as to avoid the problem with vagueness that I mentioned earlier. That said, I do not want to use Vietnamese word excessively either, because doing so when there are completely serviceable English equivalents feels a little bit to me like exotifying my own culture. On the other hand, I do want to make sure to use Vietnamese word or some most likely unconventional combination of English word when off-the-shelf one just don't convey the entire subtlety of the concept. It is a fine balance. And that's it from me. I would love to hear your thoughts on naming the unfamiliar, either in the work that you read or in your own writing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I see you all in my next video. Bye!